the guys who are disheartened about, what's happening to their potential dating partners, I always say to them, look, I've just had a son, and people are like, well, are you worried about your son growing up in a world that's increasingly anti-male? No, I'm not. Because what I know is, in that world, the men who are actually men are going to clean up. And so my message to young men is always the same. Be better, do better, create, build, grow, learn, improve your skills, get better at communicating, get better at being funny, get better at making money, build something cool, and then you're not going to have any shortage of dating opportunities from really high quality women who want to marry, have kids if that's what you want to do, and settle down. Because at the end of the day, we're all our biology. There's certain things that most of us are going to want. So I wouldn't be despondent if I were a young man. I'd be focusing on, how do I do better?
Welcome to the Veritas Podcast. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm here with Konstantin Kisin, a comedian, co-host of the show Triggernometry, and author of the new book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Konstantin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, Konstantin. I suspect that a lot of people who watch this show probably also watch Triggernometry and are familiar with who you are. Also, a quick note for my listeners, there is an air show near my apartment today. If you happen to hear some jets in the background a little bit, apologies for that. But yeah, I think a lot of people listening to this will be familiar with you, Konstantin, but just for those who aren't, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are and particularly why you wrote your new book, which I have read, by the way, and I'm going to hold it up for a second. An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West is a fantastic book that I can recommend to everybody. It's been a really great read. But tell us a little bit about who you are and why you decided to write this book.
So I was born in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, towards the end of the Soviet Union. And by the time that I was 11 or 13, I can never remember, but in my early teens, I came to England, to the UK. My parents were quite prosperous and wealthy at the time for a brief period in my family history. And so they sent me to a British boarding school. From there, I went to a British university, was not able to graduate because by that point, my parents had no money at all. So I've kind of seen, living in Russia, I saw a lot of wealth, particularly when the Soviet Union collapsed. My parents were quite wealthy for a short period of time. I also saw a lot of poverty around me when I was growing up early in my life, and also later when my family sort of ran out of money all of a sudden. So that's kind of my background, and then I had a normal career. I ran my own translation business for a while before I got bored of that and decided to become a stand-up comedian, and I did that for a few years. And during that process, I met my Triggernometry co-host Francis Foster. We started a YouTube show called Triggernometry in order to explore many of the cultural and political issues that are happening at the moment. And it was kind of a reflection of both of our political awakening to some extent, and noticing that some things were happening around us that we didn't particularly like. There were trends that were happening in the West. I being from the Soviet Union, Francis' family being from Venezuela, half of his family. We both had an experience with what the far left is capable of when it's around to run amok. And as two people who sort of were coming from a center-left position, seeing the left going in this crazy direction was definitely something that made us question a lot of the things that were happening. Now, we're not we've never released a video saying why I left the left or anything like that. We just felt that the direction of travel was very questionable. At least that was the initial way we would have described it, and we saw a lot of it in the comedy industry because, as we know, politics is downstream of culture, and we noticed that in the cultural sphere, and particularly some of these rather crazy ideas were really, really starting to take root and manifest themselves in ways that we were becoming increasingly alarmed about. And now as you say, I co-host Triggernometry. I write on my own Substack, and I used to write for a bunch of national newspapers and things like that, but I prefer to write for my own thing now on my Substack. And the book, which I'm very grateful to say is a Sunday Times bestseller, came out a couple of months ago and is doing very well. And the reason I wanted to write it is I wanted to remind people of the incredible opportunities that we have, how fortunate we are to be living in the West, and to caution people against throwing away the baby with the bathwater, because I think it's fair to say, Scott, that we'd all accept that our societies are imperfect. The history of our countries, both yours and mine, are imperfect, but that does not necessarily mean that we need a sort of radical overthrow of the system as it is. And it troubles me when I hear people talking about that. I was very shocked, actually, by the extent to which people were willing to go along with some of the madness that came in the summer of 2020, defending things that were indefensible, even though, of course, racism remains a problem. People do get mistreated sometimes because of their skin color. I'm someone who's experienced this, but I didn't think that necessarily merited defunding the police or ending capitalism or destroying the nuclear family or whatever.
Perfectly reasonable solutions from level-headed people.
Yeah, and we've seen how they've played out. What happens when you defund the police? Well, guess what? The neighborhoods where there's the most crime, they're the ones that suffer the most from the lack of policing. So I'm just a guy somewhere in the center of the political spectrum who thinks it's really important that people on both sides of the argument can express themselves, can be heard without being labeled and smeared and attacked. And also, that we've got to stay away from the extremism. I think we'd all accept that extremists on the right are a problem. I think they're a smaller problem at the moment than the extremists on the left, because the extremists on the right don't have power over the institutions. They haven't captured the media. They haven't captured much of our politics. They haven't captured much of the cultural conversation, etc., which the far left radicals have. But I'm just someone who's very wary of extremists from both sides. And so I'm trying to hold the line in the middle and say, yes, that we've got some issues, but we shouldn't go off the deep end in either direction.
Yeah, I mean, from reading your book and having listened to some other interviews with you, I understand that your perspective is extremely valuable, and it's one that we don't get a lot, because you're an immigrant who is actually critical of a lot of this supposedly progressive policy, a lot of these things that are going on in the kind of wokeosphere. It all kind of gets conglomerated. Sometimes it's put into the socialism bucket or the communism bucket or the woke bucket. But what it all ultimately comes down to is there's this obsession with equity that people didn't really hear as much until the last maybe 6 or 7 years. People are just talking about equity, equity, equity now. We hear politicians, school teachers, people in the corporate sphere talking about it. And it is sort of core to the ideologies of socialism and communism, which obviously, coming from the USSR, you're very familiar with, and people who read your book would find that out. But what I wanted to ask you is, considering that equity is something that, one of my main takeaways from your book was that in theory, at its best, it is idealistic. And in practice, at its worst, it's completely disastrous. And that's something that you can look at the historical record and see, like in the USSR. Considering that, why is it that so many people seem to have become obsessed with it? Why is there so much advocacy for equity? And you'll notice the word equality has kind of gone out of fashion. It's all about equity, equity, equity. Why do you think that is, that we've become so obsessed with it, if it's something that, from your experiences and the experiences of so many people, we know it can lead to this sort of spiritual death of a nation?
Well, there are a large number of answers to your question. The first of them is what you said yourself. They're idealistic, and young people in particular are easily seduced by idealistic visions of the world, because one of the things that as a young person, and we all go through this, I myself too, as a young person, one of the things that you're deeply uncomfortable with is the idea that the world is not perfect. This is a very uncomfortable idea for a young person to accept, because as a young person you view the future as this space of infinite opportunity and possibility. Even if you yourself are not having a great time, and maybe you feel constrained and you're insecure and you lack confidence, which most young people do, nonetheless there is a feeling as a young person that perfection is possible. And the process of growing up and maturing and becoming an adult is realizing actually life is difficult, is flawed, it's imperfect, and there's no getting away from that. And it doesn't matter how driven or ambitious you are. Yes, you can do a lot of things, you can create a lot of things, but life isn't going to be perfect. You're not going to find somebody who's the perfect partner for you. You're not going to find someone who is You're not going to find a system of government that's the perfect system of government. You're not going to find an economic attitude that maintains permanent growth with no setbacks over a 100-year trajectory. You're not going to reach perfection in any area of life. And that is very difficult for people to accept. And so inequality, the fact that some people have more than others, if you walk around the streets of any major city in the Western world, the fact that there are people sleeping in the street, the fact that there are people with mental illness who are not getting the care that they need, the fact that nurses and teachers get paid very little and fat cats in Wall Street make millions and billions. These are all difficult things to contend with as a young person, as frankly they should be. These are not good things for our society to have. But one of the things that happens over time as you mature and get a little bit older is you accept that no society is perfect, no economic system is perfect, no person you could meet is perfect, and so you have to take the good with the bad, the rough with the smooth. And idealistic visions of the world, like radical socialism, like some of the BLM-style Marxism, etc., they're very appealing to people who don't want to believe that the world is not perfect, who do not want to accept the imperfections. So that's number one. Why does this appeal particularly to young people? Why have people become obsessed with it? I think social media has a big role to play in this area. It has allowed the amplification of ideas that sound good but are terrible because they sound good. And if you think about what Twitter is, if you think about what other forms of social media are, it doesn't matter how practically accurate your tweet is. What matters is how many people feel good about reading it. And so if you have a terrible idea that sounds great, that is going to get a lot more attention. And, Twitter is a virtue signaling economy. The more you virtue signal to your own tribe, the more attention you're going to get. So that's what accelerates it. I also think there are a couple of bigger underlying factors, and these are not ideas that I've come up with myself. This is a result of some very interesting conversations that we've had on Triggernometry with former guests. One of the things that I find a very persuasive argument about why we are where we are, and I recommend if people are interested in exploring this further, they see our interview with a woman called Mary Eberstad and a more recent interview we did with a woman called Louise Perry, who both talk about the impact of the sexual revolution on society. And Mary Eberstad in particular, she wrote a book called Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Gave Us Identity Politics. And her central argument essentially is this: the sexual revolution changes the family dynamic and the importance of the family unit in Western societies. And it's essentially a technological shift rather than feminists will take a lot of the credit because they legitimated a lot of the changes that were happening thanks to technology, the pill, etc. They enabled different modes of behavior for men and women, and they essentially put an end to the need for men to commit to women with whom they have sex. And as a result of that, you end up with generations increasingly that end up growing up in family environments where there's not necessarily two parents around. This creates generation upon generation of people who are frustrated that they didn't have the family unit that they needed. They feel that the world is unfair, the world is broken. They didn't have a wholesome childhood that they might have had in the past. And so their view of the world is fundamentally nihilistic. It's fundamentally one of frustration, one of dissatisfaction. And then, of course, you pile on top of that the fact that the modern capitalist system that we have is not giving young people the things that they need and want and would have had in the past. This is the first generation of people now who are probably going to be worse off than their parents. In the UK, we have a gigantic housing problem, which means that young people are not able to partner up and settle and have kids at the age that they would have done. I mean, I'm about to be 40, and I literally had our first child a few months ago, and my wife and I are enjoying having our son so much. Like, I'd love to, pump out at 3 or 4 more, but realistically, the time window that we've left ourselves probably doesn't allow us to do that if we wanted to have that many kids. If my wife wanted to, which I'm skeptical about. But right, so you put all these things together. It's an ideology that appeals to young people who are idealistic. Young people have problems. Social media encourages people to say things that aren't true, that make them feel good. And we've got a massive breakdown of the family over 6 decades. Put all that together, it's a potent mix, which is why it's important, I think, to do what I did in the book, which is to address some of this radical progressivist craziness, and at the same time to also say we've got some problems that we need to fix. And I think certainly in the UK, the housing problem is a big part of that.
Yeah, it's very true that for the younger I say the younger generation. I'm 27, so I guess I'm millennial, but I'm not quite Gen Z. I'm kind of on the border year. But I can say, from experience, there is this vibe and this feeling of nihilism and pessimism that leaves people my age very vulnerable. My age, and certainly people who are younger, it leaves us very vulnerable to these utopian visions of like everything can be perfect and equal, and we can live in a world where there's no racism and there's no inequality and there's none of these things. And that is part of what is so dangerous in my view, and you definitely go into this in the book for sure, about these utopian ideologies, socialism, communism, equity. Again, a lot of times they sound really great in theory, but the thing that is so terrible about that is they all ultimately end up being these sort of cures that are worse than the disease. Because if you try to, before when I brought up the examples of you're always hearing from these people with these utopian visions, we're going to end racism, we're going to end inequality. These are things you cannot end. You can minimize them, you can contain them, and that's great. That's something we need to do. We don't like racism, we don't like inequality, right? But if you try to totally eradicate these ineradicable parts of, having a civilized society, these perhaps unfortunate parts, but these inevitable parts, you'll end up creating worse problems than you had to begin with. So for instance, there are people in the United States, and I'm sure in England as well, on the left who would go so far as to say perhaps racism should be illegal. It sounds ridiculous, but here in the United States, we have Ibram X. Kendi, the academic, who said there should be a department of anti-racism that actually enforces executive power over racism. So it's not completely out of the question. It would be a great way to try and end racism, but then you would create this nightmare scenario where you're sitting there thinking, okay, what's a racist misdemeanor? What's a racist felony? Who decides how to prove racism beyond a reasonable doubt? You end up with way bigger problems than what you started off with. So, considering this, Konstantin, how do you think we can get people, especially in younger generations, to understand that despite their understandable sensitivity to things like bigotry and inequality, how do you think we can get people, especially the younger generation, to understand that it's better to live with a minimal amount of these things and to try and contain them and minimize them than it is to try and totally eradicate them with these very, very radical policy proposals and ideologies?
Well, it's the big question, of course. As I say, I think a lot of this, people think of this as ideological battles, but I do think the practical reality of young people's lives is probably what is making more of them susceptible to these worldviews than it would have done in the past. I think some of the numbers I'm seeing, particularly there's a guy called Eric Kaufman who we've had on our show a few times. He's a professor here in London, and he's putting out a lot of research showing the demographic data about young people in your age group and younger. And there's a big gender split. Young men are actually becoming less liberal than some of their peers. Some of the people of other generations were at their time. Young women are going woke at a rate of knots. So what's going on there, I don't exactly know. But as I say, if you consider the average differences between men and women and the prioritization of emotion over other ways of processing the world, an ideology which appeals to your emotions and has little regard for facts is more likely to appeal particularly to young women. So I think that's possibly part of what's driving it. But in terms of the solution, look, my view is you've got to fix the problems on the ground, and the breakdown of the family is, I don't know how you fix that right now. I wish I could tell you. I think the first step to admitting to solving the problem is admitting you have one. So far, no one wants to admit that we have that problem. The breakdown of the family talking point is a explicitly right-wing talking point that only evil, bigoted right-wing conservatives currently express. I am not an evil right-wing conservative bigot, but I still care about children growing up without dads because I know that it's not good for them. So until we can get to a point where we can have an honest conversation, this is why the slogan of Triggernometry is honest conversations with fascinating people, because you have to have an honest conversation about an issue if you ever stand any chance of solving it. And we have to have an honest conversation about what the dating market, the sexual revolution, the current sexual norms that we have are doing to our society and are doing to the outcomes and the feelings of children, first and foremost. I think a lot of it is down to that. You have to address the housing crisis in the UK and some of the other things that are likely to impact people of your generation and younger in terms of their ability to get on with life, to be successful, to make money, to feel like the American dream is still available to them. I think some of them don't feel that at all. And then you have to, hopefully write books that educate them about reality and what it's like when you pursue these idealistic objectives in an extreme way. I always make the point, if we have a society where we can't eliminate rape, murder, and cancer, it's possible we might not be able to eliminate people being mean to each other on the internet. I'm just hypothesizing there. Do you know what I mean? So we may have to accept a level of that we need a level of tolerance for people's bigotry and prejudice if we're ever going to get anywhere. So I think those are some of the answers. But yeah, I do, at the moment at least, my view is that the breakdown of the family is one of the most important and underappreciated elements of this whole thing. And until we fix that, until people who have children bring them up together, and until children have a safe environment at home where they grow up feeling like they actually got what they needed, I don't know that we're going to get that far.
Yeah, there is a strange kind of anti-family bent to a lot of this woke stuff. I mean, when Black Lives Matter was kind of exploding in 2020, part of their website was wanting to break down the nuclear family, which, I certainly was not aware was one of the things they advocated for. And I think eventually they might have removed that as well.
But it makes sense, Scott, if you think about it. It makes perfect sense, because if part of the support base for this ideology is people who are deeply resentful and frustrated about their own childhood, and that is their experience of the family, it makes a lot of sense that they would have some sort of angst about the idea of the family. And so it is, it always struck me that there are the whole swathes of feminism that are really important and are doing important work to ensure that women are safe from male violence, ensure that the other areas where women are objectively discriminated against and mistreated are addressed. And at the same time, there are other strands of feminism, much more sort of progressive types of feminism, that are, to me, always seemed like just a bunch of people who are angry at their dads. And that strand of feminism is the woke strand of feminism. And likewise, in many other areas, people who are angry at their dad are not going to be the sort of people that advocate for wholesome, coherent, integral families. They are going to want to rebuild the family structure from the ground up, if that is even how far they go in their thinking. I think much more likely a lot of it is just nihilism about that system. Their experience of childhood was bad, therefore childhood is bad. Let's reshape the world to make childhood better, or to make me feel better about my childhood, or whatever. I see a lot of this sort of Freudian element to it.
And it does put us in a position. I mean, you mentioned before how men are actually not necessarily moving to the left all that much, but women are flailing to the left, moving super quickly to the left. And I think that some of the more extreme and inherently hostile feminist rhetoric has something to do with that. What do we hear from a lot of that rhetoric? It's that women are wonderful and can do no wrong and should never apologize for anything, which is actually not a great way to live your life if you're a man or a woman, but it's what a lot of women are hearing these days. And men are, of course, these awful, terrible oppressors. And part of what's so unfortunate about that is that, as we're kind of alluding to, the basis for a successful society is cooperation between men and women. I've got my girlfriend in the next room. I don't know what I'd do without her. She's actually currently wrangling our cat so that he's not scratching at the door while doing this interview. So, it's such an important thing. And I always struggle to understand how anyone cannot see the long-term consequences of breaking that down, that relationship between men and women. And then, of course, you get into the whole other category of even the definitions of what men and women are have been broken down, not just the social categories. So it's putting us in a very, very dangerous spot, and I'm not sure what the resolution might be.
Well, look, I'm really glad to hear that you are in a good relationship with your girlfriend. I'm someone who, I met my wife when we were 18. We were married at 20, been together ever since. My wife is the absolute bedrock of my life. Our relationship is something without which I'd never be where I am. I dedicated the book to my wife because she's a huge part of my journey, and it's a really important thing that I think young people don't hear enough. Particularly if you're a guy, but even as a woman, whatever it is that you want to do in your life, it is so much easier to do it with somebody you love, someone who's different to you, someone who can give you advice and guidance and support and help you grow. It's so much easier to do that, to do anything that you want when you've got that stability at home. And of course, when it comes to having children, I mean, the stats are all there. You know, you're 20 times more likely to go to prison if you didn't have a father. All that stuff that people in our space all know. And I agree with you, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. The idea that the idea that we would try to present the relationship between men and women as a battle, it is the most batshit, counterproductive, insane idea that I've ever come across. The two groups of people that more than anybody need to work together to survive and thrive in any society that's ever existed. The idea that we would try to divide them and split them apart is completely insane. Now, I would say this, particularly to people of your generation, especially the young guys. There's a lot of people are like, well, women are getting woke and I need to do this and that. The truth is, young women are only going to be woke for a period of time. When they start to think, when the biological clock starts ticking, you suddenly find out whatever their political views, socially, they're quite conservative. They want a house. They want you to earn the money. Like all that stuff happens pretty rapidly. So, I think the guys who are disheartened about, what's happening to their potential dating partners, I always say to them, look, I've just had a son, and people are like, well, are you worried about your son growing up in a world that's increasingly anti-male? No, I'm not. Because what I know is, in that world, the men who are actually men are going to clean up. And so my message to young men is always the same. Be better, do better, create, build, grow, learn, improve your skills, get better at communicating, get better at being funny, get better at making money, build something cool, and then you're not going to have any shortage of dating opportunities from really high quality women who want to marry, have kids if that's what you want to do, and settle down. Because at the end of the day, we're all our biology. There's certain things that most of us are going to want. So I wouldn't be despondent if I were a young man. I'd be focusing on how do I do better. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Women will look at their older sisters who got to 40 and the only thing they have to show for it is empty bottles of wine and cats. They're not going to look at those women and go, oh, that's what I'd like to emulate. So this is going to get turned around, in my opinion, because at the end of the day, I don't think that, once it comes down to the very basic genetic instinct that all human beings have. Not all. I mean, we all do have it. We don't necessarily all act on it. But generally speaking, the desire to procreate is pretty strong, particularly in women, particularly after they get into their late 20s, early 30s. So I wouldn't be so concerned about it if I were a young guy. I'd be thinking, okay, everyone around me is being a bit of a woke idiot. How do I stand out from this crowd? It's actually a lot easier for me. It's always, I used to run my own translation business. It's always how I thought about it. People were like, well, the whole industry is doing this. And I was like, well, that creates a great backdrop for me to look cool against, And I think that should be the attitude for dating. It's like, don't be apologetic about who you are. And you'll probably find that there are lots of women that aren't interested in you. But the ones that are going to be cool. And the people that you actually want to spend your life with.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and I can say from personal experience, it's just so important not to get disheartened, not to feel sorry for yourself. We've all had our struggles with dating. I had a big struggle before I met my girlfriend about 4 years ago, in part because the dating environment is kind of poisoned by a lot of the rhetoric that's going on. I started doing online dating around 2017, which is a weird time to start doing that because a lot of women were starting to get some interesting ideas in the early days of the kind of anti-Trump woke explosion. But at the end of the day, I agree with you so much that you have to work through that rhetoric being around. You have to find the diamonds in the rough and look for people that you can create a life with. And it's unfortunate that, the relationships between men and women have come under attack by kind of the woke orthodoxy is what I like to call it a lot, because I do consider it somewhat of a religion. And it's not the only sort of fundamental part of human existence that does come under attack by this ideology. Another thing you talk about in your book, and of course you are a comedian yourself, is you talk about the attack on comedy, sort of this like war on laughter that is being waged by the woke, where they say that because of their sensitivities or because of the narratives they want to present, there's certain jokes, not even statements, but jokes that are a threat to these narratives and that are too offensive to be told, even on a stage in a comedy club, or maybe even just sitting around with your mates having a laugh. And I found that really interesting. I mean, it is true that it's not just anti-Western to be against comedy, because comedy is such a big part of our entertainment and media sphere, but it's also kind of anti-social and fundamentally anti-human. You mentioned in the book how it's such a big part of how we process information, laughter. It's such a big part of how we build relationships with other people. Again, what do you do when you're sitting around with your friends? Usually laugh and kind of shoot the shit a little bit and take the piss out of each other. So my question for you, Konstantin, on that note is like, how is it possible that the woke could be sort of winning that war on laughter? They have been able to make a lot of comedy seem kind of watered down and sterile. You have this clapter phenomenon where a comedian like Hannah Gadsby isn't necessarily even trying to make people laugh a lot of the time. How is it that they're able to take something that people enjoy so much and love so much, and people know, they know deep down is so important to them? How is it that this ideology has been able to water down and sterilize it so much?
Well, Hannah Gadsby, first of all, is an interesting example because she, of course, did a show about why she's quitting comedy before doing about 3 follow-ups in the following years. So it's an interesting approach. All power to her. I don't have a particular problem with people doing entertainment in any way that they choose to. I was reassured. We were in the United States a few weeks ago, and I was reassured speaking to the comedians there that actually in a few places in the United States, Joe Rogan's club in Austin and the Comedy Cellar in New York, where we saw Kevin Hart there, there's still a culture of being able to do the jokes that you want to do. The audience is, particularly in New York, maybe a bit more sensitive, but you can still do the sort of stuff that you want to do. But here in the UK, the problem is much worse. We have laws on the books now which mean that comedians are routinely being investigated by the police. Comedians are having their shows cancelled. We've had just in the last week the cancellation of Jerry Sadowitz, who's one of the best live comedians this country has ever produced. And on we go. So that's a problem that we have, because in the UK we've gone a lot further down that path legislatively. We have laws on the books now that are aimed at regulating what people can and can't say at a comedy club. And one of the reasons that this is happening, of course, as you know, is the deliberate conflation of jokes and opinions. People want to pretend now that if I make a joke, I believe the thing that I said. Even people who run comedy clubs now, some of them believe this. This is what happened to Jerry Sadowitz. His show was cancelled under the slogan of "We do not agree with the opinions this character has expressed." It's a character. It's a comedy character. And the opinions are expressed sarcastically and ironically, but of course people want to take what you say at face value and literally and then present it. So, I think part of it is that comedy is supposed to be transgressive. It's supposed to challenge orthodoxies. It's supposed to call out hypocrisies and inconsistencies in various ideologies. And progressive extremists don't want that to happen, so that's why they're going after it.
Yeah, it's just so unfortunate, because comedy is such a big part of like how we enjoy our lives. The way that I've always framed it, like I was kind of framing it before, is there's a war on fun. Like there's a war on laughter. It seems like in the last 5 years or so, in a lot of places, it just feels like even in like a private conversation, you have to tiptoe around certain topics, especially if you're in a workplace. I mean, you have no idea what kind of joke that you could have maybe just said to your buddy at work 10 years ago could actually get you fired from your job today. Even if you were to say something outside of work. And it sounds like this is fascinating to me, and I'd love to hear more about it. I mean, I'm so used to being in the U.S. where like we would never dream of having a law that says you can't tell a certain joke, although we're slowly but surely getting to the point where I wonder about that, what a President Kamala Harris in a few years might be thinking about in her legislative package. But I mean, how has that been for you as somebody who was in comedy for so long and is a comedian? Just has that been somewhat demoralizing? How new of a phenomenon is that as well? Is that like the last 5 years or 10 years? Or?
Yeah, I think it really took off in the last 7 years. I think so we have a lot of data now on how the Great Awakening, quote unquote, happened. And largely it's a product of social media because you see the mention of words like racism, white privilege, systemic this, systemic that, etc., shot through the roof when social media became a big part of the media landscape. And so social media is a big part of the process by which this has occurred, and it started to feed into comedy, entertainment, and whatever. Prior to that, it was pretty much a free-for-all, and you could make the sort of jokes that you wanted. And of course, that is what people actually like. They like comedy that pushes boundaries. They like comedy that's potentially a bit offensive, but they like it anyway. They like that. And we've had shows, massive shows here in the UK that everybody used to sit down and watch every week. You probably wouldn't know them over there, but Mock the Week, The MASH Report, Live at the Apollo. These shows are all getting not cancelled, but they're not getting renewed because they destroyed their own brand. They started censoring people. They also had a massive diversity drive, so they drove out all the funny people to make sure that they had the right faces and the right genders and the right whatever, and who all had the right opinion, of course. And they replaced the funny people with those people, so that they destroyed the quality from two different sides. And those shows are now basically not getting renewed. And that's, I think, how we've got to this point. And the comedy industry, certainly in the UK, is very, very insular. It's a small handful of people. And I wrote a Substack recently in relation to the Jerry Sadowitz cancellation, which I talk about how the woman who runs the Edinburgh Comedy Awards, this is the awards at the biggest comedy festival in the world, which is essential to being successful in the UK in the comedy industry. She said in 2018 that she looks forward to a new era of woke comedy where woke comedians listen to this part, where woke comedians will be the ones deciding what isn't acceptable. Right? So this has been driven from the inside as well. So you've got all these three. However, there is a silver lining to all of this, which is it's driven people like me and Francis, my Triggernometry co-host, off the comedy circuit and onto the internet, where we're having a lot of success. So I do see that there's a pushback coming, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, the point about social media is well taken, and it is kind of a blessing and a curse. I mean, I know social media has been, YouTube, social media, Triggernometry has had a lot of success with social media. I'm very happy with this sort of small little niche I've carved out for myself on this show with social media. But your point about it is well taken. It does seem like I've looked at the Google Trends too, Konstantin, and kind of some of the research, and right at because social media starts to really explode around like 2014, 15. Yes, it had existed before that, but then a lot of older people and corporations started getting on. But before, I being 27, I had a kind of interesting relationship with the internet. I remember when it was almost exclusively younger people that used it, religiously, like every day. And
gamers and people like that. I was one of those people. Yes.
Oh, yeah. And then around 2014-ish, a lot of corporations and older people got on and kind of ruined it. But one of the impacts of that we saw was everyone, I've said this on the show before, it's like everyone kind of became a public figure, which is not healthy. Everyone's thought that their opinion on everything at all times has to be shared, and that includes comedy. People who, one of the most bizarre things about the past 7 years has been seeing people who were not at a comedy show complaining about a joke that was told at a comedy show they did not even attend. It'd be one thing if maybe you paid to get in and you really didn't like the show, and it would be like, okay, I guess you paid money for it, you didn't have a good time. It does seem like there is this incentive through social media to share your opinions on everything and to be negative about everything. And it's provided this sort of heckler's veto to people who frankly have no business having that veto. People who, again, I just don't understand the mental gymnastics it takes to complain about jokes to begin with, but then also jokes that you were not even present when they were being told.
Well, we talked about it already, right? Social media incentivizes that sort of behavior. If you complain about a joke you didn't hear, you can get a lot of clicks and likes and retweets, and you get to be part of a movement, and you're saving the world from the evil racist comedian and all the rest of it. I just think we are incentivized to complain about including about things which we did not ourselves experience. And this is, of course, a massive problem with comedy, because comedy is all about the context. The joke is all about the way it was told, what was said before, what was said after, how did that situation get addressed in the room. And because comedians, we think very carefully, usually, the good comedians, about how are we presenting certain material, what is it that you need to do to build up to it, how do you then diffuse the tension afterwards. It's a process that's quite creative. Like when I did my first show at the Edinburgh Festival in 2019, it was a show called All Well That Ends Well, and it was based around this safe space contract that I turned down for a comedy gig. But basically I was making a lot of jokes, but also an argument about why free speech is important. And as part of it, I spent 20 minutes setting a piece up, the culmination of which was me showing that there is a context in which even a non-black person like me can use the N-word and it's not racist. And that took 30 minutes. It takes 30 minutes to do that. You need 20 minutes of setup and 10 minutes of after, and a lot of good jokes that are tried out in different environments and polished, and you do this bit here and then do this bit afterwards, and that's how you get there. But if you take that joke in isolation and show it on breakfast television at 7 in the morning, it's not the same joke. It's not even the same thing. It's not even a joke in that context. But that is what we do increasingly. So I agree with you. People who complain about entertainment or comedy or anything that they haven't seen, they should get zero interest from anybody in what they have to say.
Yeah, well, and their tactics are so, to anyone who's even looking at them with a remotely critical eye, they're so transparently craven and manipulative. I mean, speaking of the N-word, there was the Joe Rogan incident from a few months back where there were all these clips of him. Yeah, he was saying the N-word. It's not a word you're really supposed to have in your vocabulary if you're not black. But he was saying them because he was joking around in his podcast. Sometimes he was just mentioning the word. He's not like...
No, but see, it's not even as simple as that, Scott, just to be clear as well. Sorry to interrupt. It was not that he was joking around and he was using the N-word. Most of those clips is him quoting somebody using that word.
Yeah.
And you've got to understand, Joe's 55 years old. When he was our age, it was perfectly normal for a white person to, let's say, quote Lenny Bruce or quote Richard Pryor or quote Chris Rock using that word. For example, Chris Rock has a famous routine, black people versus the N-word, right? And if you're quoting that and you're 55 years old, you've grown up in a society where it's perfectly acceptable to quote that verbatim. And then suddenly someone somewhere decided that it's not possible anymore. I just wanted to say that because I don't think Joe was just sitting around, going, hey, like there was even more context to it than that. And of course, if you clip together every time he uses it and take it out of the context, who he was talking to, what was he talking about, what was he quoting, yeah, you can make him look really bad.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you adding that context, and that's absolutely correct. Language has context. I said before, there's kind of a war on fun and a war on laughter. There's also kind of a war on context.
Well, and they go together, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's all tactical. It's all strategic. And it kind of pisses me off when I see it because it's like I don't understand how anyone falls for it. And I guess I generally assume that people aren't really falling for it. Like I have a hard time believing that somebody sees these 3-second clips of Joe Rogan or something and is like, oh yeah, I bet you that was him using it as a racial epithet. Like who in the world would ever imagine that like the most popular podcaster in the world would call someone the N-word on their podcast? Like, do you think these people even believe this stuff, or is it, like, what is going on there? Are they in some kind of religious trance when they're going off on Joe Rogan?
Well, religious trance is an interesting thing. I actually like that description because I do think a lot of this is ideological capture. We need this person to be the bad guy, therefore I will believe anything. You see that with what people describe as Trump derangement syndrome. And I was never a fan of Trump, and I'm not a fan of Trump, but some people's irrational reaction to him, a visceral gut instinct and a desire to believe anything that is negative about him, I think took over. And so some of it is tribal capture. This is the enemy, so I'll believe anything I want. And I also think, as with most of these things, there's just a lot of cowardice, Scott. A lot of people don't want to be the guy defending the guy who's on camera saying the N-word. They don't want to come out and go, actually, no one wants to be the kid with his fucking hand up at the back of the class. No one wants to be that kid because they know that what good... If you are friends with a bunch of people who are progressives, let's say, and this thing comes out, and they're all going on about how Joe Rogan's this evil race, who wants to be the guy? Actually, no one wants to be that guy, except contrarians like me who actually care about the truth, or people who are already on Team Rogan or whatever, or Team Trump or whatever it is. So the reality is, and this is something that frustrates me very much because I am someone who really... I'm not saying I'm always fair. I'm not saying what I say is always true because it's not. I'm not a perfect person. But I do place a high value on fairness, and I do try to avoid unfairness and hypocrisy as much as I can. And I don't care if it's my enemy or someone that is an opponent of mine or someone with whom I disagree. I don't like people being treated badly or lied about, even if it helps me in my fight against them or whatever. So I have disagreements with people over all sorts of things, but I wouldn't ever want them or their arguments to be misrepresented. Most people, I don't say this to look good, but it's just an observation that I've had, don't care about fairness, and they don't care about a lack of hypocrisy nearly enough. And if someone that they don't like is being smeared unfairly, they're okay with it. And then, of course, there's just a lot of people who are afraid to challenge that too.
Yeah. Well, sometimes even if someone is friends with or they do like is being smeared, they won't do anything about it. The unfortunate thing is we are such tribal creatures at our core. We want to be accepted by the group. I mean, we've talked about all of the incentives to, complain about shit on social media. There's also the incentives to not, like you said, stick your hand up in the back of the class. Like, actually, I kind of disagree about what you're saying about Joe Rogan. It's really hard to be that guy, especially in certain environments. If you're in any, in the US, it's like any major city school system. It's like all of your peers are going to have these super left-wing parents, and they're going to be super left-wing. And by the way, I don't mean to conflate that all left-wing people think this way, but you know what I mean, like woke. But it's leading us down a path where we essentially, the way to summarize it is, we are incentivized to go along with these lies, and we are de-incentivized to have honest, truthful conversations like I try to do on this show, like you do all the time on Triggernometry. And that was also something that, getting back to your book for a minute, that was a huge part of what allowed Stalinism to go on for so long, was that people were they were heavily socially sanctioned. I mean, more than socially sanctioned. We're talking about the USSR here. They were sent to gulags for talking about things honestly. I'm wondering if maybe you want to talk a little bit about kind of the parallels. Obviously, we're not in nearly as bad of a situation as we were, as the USSR was at that time. But I'd love to hear a little bit about those. Yeah.
At that time, yes. This is one of the things I talk about. So whenever I bring up this comparison, occasionally some people who think that they know about it and want to challenge me, they're like, well, you're comparing it to the gulags. No, but the USSR wasn't all about the gulags. By the time I was growing up in the early 80s, there were no gulags at that point. But my grandfather, who criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in a private conversation, I talk about this in An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, as you know. He was reported to the KGB by a guy who was present to this conversation. He was fired from work. His wife was fired from her job, and both their kids were kicked out of university. And they were essentially made unemployable. Is that different to what happens to some people now? I mean, look at my friend Brett Weinstein, for example. Right? He took a position at Evergreen College. Him and Heather, his wife, were both fired from their jobs, made unemployable in academia. And the result is, thank God, they have the power of the internet allows them to make a living now. But if it wasn't for that, they'd be in exactly the same position as my grandfather. So I think comparisons, obviously, to the 1930s and the Soviet Union are ridiculous. But I do think we're heading in that direction. There are all sorts of other changes in our societies that trouble me because they indicate that we're moving in that direction. And that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. I mean, people are constantly trying to counter these very valid concerns by saying, oh, well, you're not being thrown in jail for making this joke, whatever. And it's like...
Well, in the UK, some people are.
Well, in the UK, you actually can be, criminally prosecuted.
Not in jail, but yeah.
Maybe fined, I think. But even speaking just from what's going on here in the US, it's like, I'll be honest, I'm somebody who knows that there's the possibility that if my employer discovered this podcast, some people might have guessed that Veritas is not my real last name. It's not. That's part of that is an attempt to protect my professional identity and my ability to make a living and, hopefully raise some children in a few years and put food in their mouths. Because people will say, so many times people have said, like, it's only against the First Amendment free speech if you're getting literally thrown in jail. And I'm like, how much free speech do you have? If not only can you be fired from your job, your current job, for saying something that goes against the woke orthodoxy, but you can become permanently unemployable. As you said, Brett Weinstein is very lucky that he is an intellectually gifted man. And so he had so much to offer the marketplace of ideas that he was naturally going to land on his feet. And he's a man of great character. By the way, Brett, if you're out there, I'd love to have you on the show. He's a great person. And so he was able to survive his kind of cancellation attempt and probably come out stronger on the other side. He is a survivor. And then when you hear, I say that because there's survivorship bias. He's one of the people who actually made it through that meat grinder. There are hundreds of stories of people who have lost their jobs, many of whom have children, and who became permanently unemployable, particularly during the George Floyd racial reckoning riots of 2020. I mean, that was an insane moment where there was Konstantin, I don't know if you remember this story. There was a college professor here in the U.S. who was teaching Mandarin, and there is a word in Mandarin that sounds like the N-word. It is not the N-word, but it sounds a little bit like it. And he was teaching that word. I don't even know if I could say it on the show without Susan Wojcicki at YouTube maybe throwing a fit or whatever, so I'm going to not. But, he says the word, and a student reported him, and he got suspended. I don't know what the ultimate result was. He may have gotten his job back. But the fact that he even had to worry about that is astonishing. Because, again, the war on context there is in full effect. I mean, how optimistic are you in a situation where we're this far gone? And like you said, people are it's like a civil penalty there in the UK. I'm not intimately familiar with the legal situation, but I know you actually can be fined. I think in Canada, too, there are comedians getting
No, in
fined.
the UK, it is now a crime to be grossly offensive.
A crime. To be grossly offensive.
Yeah, it's against the law.
And
Yeah, so I think, how optimistic am I? I don't know is the true answer. I think, as I said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We are starting to see a lot of pushback against some of the stuff here in the UK. You brought up the trans issue earlier, and on that issue we're making a lot of progress in terms of clarifying the law, in terms of, there was a Tavistock clinic which was doing a lot of these surgeries on kids that is now being sued by thousands of parents, and I've always said that would be the issue that broke this whole progressive overreach. So I think there are some good movements in the comedy scene. We've got, a comedy club called Comedy Unleashed here in the UK. When we were on Joe Rogan's show, he's building a new comedy club in Austin. And like that, we went to see one of their shows. That shit is wild, man. Like, I've not seen stuff. Even I was sitting there going, that's a bit far, So the pushback will come. How successful it is, I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see, man. But in the meantime, everybody's going to have to do their best to make sure that there is pushback and that it's effective.
Yeah, I've heard that in the UK you guys are kind of starting to parse out the gender stuff, which has been encouraging, because here in the United States that's not really happening. As a matter of fact, I know there's a lot of unfortunately hate for J.K. Rowling in her native UK, but I think like the majority of it probably comes from us Americans, just American people flipping out because they used to love Harry Potter. My girlfriend and I are big Harry Potter fans, so we get into a lot of conversations about J.K. Rowling and defending her. But yeah, it's hard to be optimistic, but there are, like you said, kind of these pockets of resistance that are showing up. And the whole sort of woke religion, if you will, I like to call it the woke orthodoxy, it does seem like something that will naturally tire itself out because it doesn't have any limiting principles. So, for instance, you said you sort of felt like a lot of the gender stuff, let's call it, the gender ideology stuff, that would kind of be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's because that is one of the best examples, that and maybe the push to defund the police are the best examples of situations where you're pushing something so outlandish, something that really sounds like it comes from like a science fiction novel in many cases, that people can't even begin to pretend to support it. They're falling all over themselves trying to use certain pronouns and things like that. I've heard people who are like fully, trying to bend the knee to the woke stuff who still can't use the pronouns right because it's just so freaking hard to reprogram yourself. So I think there is some room for optimism. I've been very curious though why, because in the UK, like you said, the speech code situation is much worse. But on the gender stuff, it seems like there's a lot more progress in the right direction. Do you have any idea why that is?
I've never thought about that question. I don't know why it is, but for some reason, the gender critical feminists in particular have done a really good job. We had a woman called Posey Parker on our show, and a bunch of others, frankly, who've really been able to make genuine change in this country because they've pulled together. I'd love to know the answer to that question, Scott. I don't know the answer to that question, but I would love to know, and I will think about it some more. But unfortunately, you won't get the answer on this podcast. Sorry.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, it's a hard, I ask a lot of hard questions. I kind of pride myself on that. So it's, I mean, honestly, it's kind of refreshing to hear somebody say like, I'm not sure. We could probably use a little bit more of that, especially in the age of social media where everyone's like, oh, I know 100%. Konstantin, there's one more question I want to ask you that kind of comes directly from your book, because it was something where I got a little bit of a history lesson. Part of reading An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West was I got like a lot of history that I didn't know about the USSR that was really fascinating. And kind of my favorite part coming towards the end is you talk about the speech that Nikita Khrushchev gave when he came to power after Stalin's death. It was this speech on the cult of personality. And it was essentially a speech that, and I just didn't know about this. I don't know if I didn't learn about it in school or if I had just like forgotten about it or whatever, but he sort of exposed Stalinism and the oppression and the brutality that it was, the damage it was doing to the Russian people. And
it had done. Stalin was dead by this point. Yeah.
Right, that it had done. And yeah, and Stalin had just died. Nikita Khrushchev is coming to power. And he not only exposed the ideology, but he exposed all of the, and used this term a lot, useful idiots, these people who had kind of been enabling that ideology and enabling that system. And he left them in this state of, I mean, you go into it a little bit, almost like suicidal misery. You know, he left them utterly defeated in this moment. And it's, I mean, I just found it really invigorating and inspiring to read about, frankly, that somebody was willing to expose something that had held so much power until maybe just a few days earlier. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think that we could see a moment like that in the near future with this sort of woke orthodoxy? Do you think that there could be a moment where somebody, maybe somebody who is cloaked in the power of leadership like Khrushchev was in that moment, takes advantage of such a moment to expose this ideology that is doing so much damage to the West and is trying to destroy the West?
Yeah, before I answer, I don't think Khrushchev used the term useful idiot himself, just to correct that little point. And his motivation was different. He needed to protect himself and to protect the idea of communism from being tainted by Stalinist repression. So that's why he was making the speech. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to walk away from this conversation thinking Khrushchev was this upstanding, brilliant, loving guy or anything like that. But this is why I warn people all the time in the West, do not go along with things that don't sit right with you. Do not suspend your own judgment about right and wrong, about morality, about the way that one ought to behave, about truth and justice, for the sake of an ideology, because people are trying to get you along, to go along with something that they're going to punish you for not going along with. It doesn't matter. You will regret going along with things that you disagree with far, far more than the temporary safety or comfort that you get from complying. And that to me is a really important point, because it is the people who do not agree but who are willing to go along. They are the critical mass that everybody, all the extremists on all sides, are fighting to get onto their side. The people like to think that what you need in order to affect change in the world is the majority of people. That's complete nonsense. What extremists are always fighting for is how to get the inert herd to go along with their point of view. And all I'm saying is either don't be part of the inert herd and think for yourself, or do not go along with things that you profoundly disagree with, because you will regret it.
Yeah, that's great. You absolutely will regret it. The long-term consequences are always way worse than the sort of short-term gains that you can get from being a useful idiot and going along with this stuff. That's a common theme on this show. It's something that I can't emphasize enough, and I thank you, Konstantin, for coming onto the show today and talking about that and everything else we've spoken about. But before we sign off, is there anything you want to plug or promote on the show today? Real quick, and I'll let you do it in a minute, but buy this book. It's a really great book. But Konstantin, anything you want to plug or promote before we sign off? I
think people who watch this will probably know of Triggernometry, my YouTube show. I'm on Twitter. And of course, the book is An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West.
All right. Thank you again, Konstantin. Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you're on iTunes, please leave a 5-star review on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe. You know the drill. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you all next time on the Veritas Podcast.